are some current problems in psychopathology that are specific to child psychopathology, but also relate to adult psychopathology as well. And I'm going to use the study of children and stress to illustrate some of these problems. One is that in child psychopathology, disorders are inferred based primarily on symptoms, not underlying biology. The treatment tends to focus mostly on symptom management, not on cures and prevention. Diagnostic entities in children tend to precede modern neuroscience. And in fact, the systems used, especially those in the United States, tend to not align with modern genetics or neuroscience, pathophysiology, or psychological mechanisms. In children, we see excessive heterogeneity and comorbidity. In fact, most children present with 3 or more specific diagnoses, suggesting that a focus on underlying problems and mechanisms may be more useful than generation of specific diagnoses. And sixth, diagnostic categories, things like depression, anxiety, enuresis, and caprices. These categories drive the entire system. Who gets research grants, which papers are accepted in top-tier journals, promotions, acceptance of clinical trials. So the whole field of child psychopathology is oriented around traditional diagnostic entities. But what I would like to focus on most this morning is the fact that these systems and categories are adevelopmental. They're really not focusing on an understanding of how and why the kinds of experiences that children have lead to problems in children's adaptive functioning. The question is, can we understand mental disorders in terms of deviations from normative child development? And in the United States now, there is an increasing emphasis on what's called research domain criteria. We call it RDoC. Now, this system was not developed based on studies of children, and in fact, child psychopathologists were really not included at all in the development of this system. However, it's my belief that this system lends itself particularly well to the study of development and psychopathology. For those of you who are not familiar with this system, it's oriented around looking at 5 main domains of functioning. This is to be used in research settings instead of diagnostic categories. And these domains of functioning are meant to be studied across levels of analysis, from the genetic, the physiological, the social, overt behavior. They include areas like negative valence systems, positive valence systems, cognitive systems, social processes, and arousal and modulatory systems. And by negative systems in the blue font, I'm illustrating examples of what these systems would look like, what kinds of behaviors a researcher would focus on. And in the red font, I've shown some examples of what a presenting symptom might look like in each of these domains. So for example, for negative valence systems, we're talking about behaviors such as threat, fear, anxiety, or loss, and this might lead to problems and altered stress reactivity. Positive valence systems include how children would respond to reward, approach, motivation, and the symptoms might include lack of pleasure, anhedonia. Cognitive systems include attention, perception, memory, and these might include things like language delays. Social processes, which I'm going to focus on this morning, include attachment, social communication, might have problems like social withdrawal, and arousal would include biological rhythms, disruptions in sleep, and this would include problems with arousal. All of these would represent, I believe, a major advance for research progress as well as treatment in child psychopathology. Let me start by pointing a study that many of you may already be familiar with. This is the famous ACEs study, which documented, based on data from individuals in California in the United States, that the risk for adult heart disease, this is heart disease when individuals are in their age 60 to 70, seems to be predicted by the number of early adverse childhood experiences that individuals had in early childhood. And it raises the question about what has happened and why. Why would something that has happened to a child when they're 3 or 4 or 5 years old affect risk in a biological system such as the cardiac system so many decades later? This is wonderful descriptive data, but it doesn't allow us to address the question of mechanisms. What has changed within the individual? This is the problem, and this is the question that we are studying in my laboratory in the United States. We're focusing on children that have had unusual early life experiences, childhood abuse, neglect, high levels of parent psychopathology, living in extreme family poverty and stress, and trying to understand how and why it is that children that have had these kinds of early life experiences are at greater risk for psychopathology and other kinds of behavioral problems. And we're focusing on this question, which is through which mechanisms are these social experiences affecting the developing brain and developing behavior, moving beyond a correlation or an association between these events and trying to understand how and why these things happen. The question is really one, I hope I've translated correctly. The question is really one about how does experience get under the skin? How does what happens to us socially, how does experience in the environment come to change underlying biology in a way that confers risk for psychopathology later in life? In our early studies, and this is a very old picture, you can see this equipment looks almost antique. It's not what we continue to use, but it illustrates some of the early studies we did looking at children's brain physiology. We used EEG studies simply to record how children with various kinds of backgrounds responded when they were asked to play a very simple game where they were asked to look and find either angry faces or happy faces or sad faces. The data turned out to be very interesting, and if you're not used to looking at EEG data, these graphs simply illustrate the amount of brain electrical activity over time. On the y-axis is the amount of brain electrical activity, and on the x-axis is simply what the brain is doing as children are presented with these faces and over time until the faces disappear. We looked at children that had experienced very severe child maltreatment. These were children that we located through government records where the US courts had determined that parents had severely physically abused their own children. What we found was that there was no difference in how the severely abused children and the typically developing children in the community responded when they saw happy facial expressions, pictures of happiness. Now, the fact that there was no difference in these two groups of children was interesting because the children who had been abused had had a lot of early life stress, probably poor nutrition, poor care, there were probably some cognitive delays, but in terms of this task, the two groups performed equally. When we showed children pictures of fearful facial expressions, we also found no difference. And that was interesting to us because the abused children probably experience a lot of fear. They probably see fear on the faces of their siblings while parents are engaged in a violent act. But still, there was no difference there. What we did find, however, was a difference in how these children responded to anger. And this interested us because if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, anger is probably the best predictive cue that something in a child's environment is about to change. If you're an abused child living in this kind of home environment, when a parent starts to become angry, that is a signal that danger is probably imminent. And by attending to these cues of anger, it is probably allowing these children the most opportunity to change their behavior, to run, to hide, to be very quiet, to do something to lower the likelihood that they might be harmed. In a sense, their brains are doing exactly what you would expect your brain to do, picking up on a cue in the environment that is an important predictor that something about the environment is about to be changed and noticing it. By the time people are afraid, something scary has probably already started to happen, making it not the best cue to predict future behavior. So the question is, if this is adaptive in the short term for these children, how might it lead to problems in these children's social functioning as they develop? Before I get to that, let me say that when I presented those older data, people often asked me, what about how these children behave when their own parent is angry, not stimuli that were developed in the laboratory, but the child's own parent? That was one question. Another question that many people asked was, well, what about tone of voice? Because it's true that we do convey emotion through our prosody and through our tone of voice, but adults' faces are up here, and little people's faces are down here. And so young children and adults tend not to be looking eye to eye. Children receive a lot of communication through the tone of voice. And so what we did in our next study is address both of these. We had parents come into the laboratory. We did a mood induction procedure where we asked mothers to tell us stories of times in their lives when they were extremely happy, or when they were extremely angry or extremely sad. We had a clinical interviewer probe for more details until the person telling the narrative was really very wrapped up in the story. And at that point, we took a picture of the mother and recorded her voice while she was speaking. And we asked her to record semantically neutral sentences like, "they came by plane," or "where are the keys?" Now, when the children came into the laboratory, they played a game where they saw either their own mother or the mother of another child who was in the study that the child was not familiar with. And in most of the trials, the expression of the face and the emotion in the voice matched. In other words, in 85% of the trials, children would see a happy face and hear a happy tone of voice, or see an angry face and hear an angry tone of voice. But every now and then, just about 15% of the time, they'd be mismatched. And so the child might see a happy face, but hear an angry voice. And in this game, children played different sections of the game where they were told, just pay attention to what you see, don't worry about what you hear, or just pay attention to what you hear, don't worry about what you see. And it was these trials that were very important. What we found was that the children's brain activity, particular here in red and with the arrow, you see the brain activity of abused children. Their brain activity really jumped up when they heard either their mother or a mother that they don't know speaking in an angry voice. This is the same result that I showed you earlier at the beginning of the talk, but even greater. And this reaction was very large, whether it was the child's own mother or even another adult they'd never met before. So this effect had really generalized. But I think what was most interesting about this study is what happened when we told children to only pay attention to voices, that what was important was what they were looking at, not what they were listening to. But they still heard an angry voice. It was irrelevant for the game. In this case, children who'd been physically abused still devoted a tremendous amount of brain processing power. They were attending to that angry voice. And what this study revealed for us was it had become like a reflex. It was automatic. When these children hear anger, their brain attends to it, and then they need to actually use their attentional resources to pull their attention back and pay attention to what they're supposed to be attending to. So this process has really become very automatic for the children. And this is one clue in understanding why these children may be more reactive, more aggressive on a playground, have the kinds of behaviors that have been of concern to psychologists. So we wanted to probe a little bit deeper to see what is happening as a result of experience with these children's understanding and processing of faces. To do that, we developed a little game for the children. This computer program took pictures of facial expressions and scrambled them so that low-level perceptual attributes remained constant. What you can see here is each of the pixels in the image has changed, and you can't detect a hairline or the mouth or the teeth or the eyes very well. And what would happen when children came in to play this game was the computer would start with the mixed up image and slowly put the pixels back into place so that the image would become clear. And the computer would stop at different points and ask the child to make a guess about what emotion the child thought was happening behind the dots. And it would look like this. It would get clearer and clearer until it was very easy to see what the emotion was. In essence, what you see here is the stimuli as the child would experience them with basically a random field of dots that slowly over time becomes a very easy to see facial expression. And the hypothesis was, if these children are really becoming experts in their lives at attending to anger, will they be able to accurately identify a facial expression of emotion when it is not fully revealed, when it's still very much an ambiguous or scrambled image? And in fact, that is what we found. No differences in how the children went about identifying the faces except for anger. And when it came to anger, it turns out that physically abused children, again in the red, were actually identifying the emotion much earlier than typically developing children based on less perceptual information. Now, one of the things about that previous study is the dots were changing, the pixels were changing, but the face wasn't actually changing. And one of the things about emotion expression is our faces, our facial musculature is changing all the time. When you are interacting with somebody, one of the things you're doing without noticing it very much is you're attending to changes in muscles in the face, to changes in tone of voice, to changes in body posture. And if you have any semblance of social competence or skill, what you're trying to do is notice that you might be eliciting an emotion in someone before that emotion fully appears. We don't wait for someone to be sobbing before we realize maybe we're saying something that's making them upset. We don't wait for someone to become fully enraged before we realize that they're getting angry. And what we wanted to capture was how children start to recognize that an emotion is emerging rather than showing them a full emotion. And so to do this, I used a little bit of deceit. I brought students into the laboratory, undergraduate students at the university, and I sat them in a room and told them that they were in the room to participate in an experiment. But the students did not know that they were seated in front of a hidden camera, and the camera was focused on their face. And they thought that they were just waiting for the experiment to begin. And so they were becoming very bored and really just sitting and waiting. And then at a certain point, we had a research assistant go into the room and deliver some news to the person. So for example, we might say, "We're very, very sorry, our equipment is broken. We're just going to give you $100 and you can go home." And that made people very happy. Sometimes we said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't want you to sit on that chair. A child urinated on it and we didn't have a chance to clean it yet." That made people a little bit disgusted. And what we were able to do is then record on video changes in facial musculature and the emergence of an emotion, and then take those videos and make individual slides showing an emotion appearing. And so I've taken one of those videos and just slowed it down a little bit so you can see what happens as someone is going from no emotion to a peak or target emotion. She just got $100. What we were able to do is create a stimulus array that had men and women of different races, all beginning with no emotional expression and progressing until a peak emotional expression. And the task that the child had to do was very easy. The child started with one of these emotions. A cartoon hand would slide across the screen. The child was told that this person was just receiving some information, and at each point, the child was asked to venture a guess about what emotion they thought was emerging. And we did this throughout the series of facial expressions. And so if you were a child in the study, you would see the base emotional expression, one of the emotions in the middle of the stimulus array, and then the peak emotional expression. And what we found from doing signal detection statistics is that physically abused children were actually able to identify an angry expression emerging earlier than typically developing children. They were not guessing anger. When an abused child ventured a guess that someone was becoming angry, they were correct. They were not saying angry if the person was not. But they were able to tell anger was emerging based on very, very minor changes in facial musculature. They were, in fact, becoming experts, perceptual experts, at being able to detect anger. And this was not true and did not generalize for other expressions of emotion. Now, this presents what I'm going to pose to you as a very challenging learning environment for children. Because up until now, I've told you or presented some evidence that physically abused children actually are very good at detecting anger. But when we looked at how they might learn about anger, the question became a little bit more confusing. For example, when we asked parents how angry they felt, it turned out that physically abusive parents said that they were angrier people. Stayed anger means how angry are you right now in the waiting room of the laboratory? And physically abused and non-abused parents both said, "No, now I'm fine, I'm not particularly angry." But trait anger, when we said in general, over the past couple of weeks, how many times have you felt really angry? How many situations in your life have really frustrated you? Physically abused parents reported being much, much more angry than did typical parents. And yet, when we looked at how those parents expressed anger, they didn't do a very good job of it. When we looked at activation of their faces, the muscles that we use to express facial expressions of emotion, they were actually showing less anger. They were showing very confused facial expressions that looked almost a little bit mix of depressed, sad, angry, not very clear muscle expression and physical conveyance of anger. And when we looked at their voices, things like shift in the frequency of tone of voice that humans use to depict emotion from tone of voice, the physically abusive parents were also not conveying their feelings very clearly. They were sending very mixed, confusing, very hard to disambiguate expressions. And so in this case, what is a child to do? You're living in a home where your parent is actually very angry. When your parent becomes very angry, they tend to get violent and they might harm you, and yet that same parent is not signaling in a very clear way that they're angry and frustrated, and so a child has to figure out what to do and how to act, how to regulate in this kind of situation, which is probably incredibly challenging, and yet it is a learning task that these children can do, but at some cost. What we've been doing is trying to understand how children are doing this, and we've been focusing on how they're learning about emotions, how they're processing errors that they make when it comes to emotions, and how they're learning what the relationship is between things like emotional signals and what those emotional signals mean for social life. We have children come into the laboratory. We do a number of behavioral and cognitive tasks with them. We do measures of brain imaging, and we also talk to them. We do extended interviews to understand what's happened in a child's life and how the child has attempted to cope with those things. One of the first things that I wanted to share with you was a study where we showed that in this slide, I'd like you to focus on the frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex. We found that in general, the more early life stress a child has experienced, the smaller their frontal lobe, and in particular the orbital frontal cortex and other aspects of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. In addition, the smaller the prefrontal cortex, the more delayed the development of the prefrontal cortex, the more likely the child was to be indicated as having behavioral problems and social problems at school. So we wanted to dig a little deeper into this and actually study learning in the laboratory. And we did a number of tasks that involve learning an inferred relationship. So this is just one example of the kind of experiment we do. Children had to figure out which of two objects would receive a reward. In this case, they might see a picture of a bell and a picture of a bottle. And over trials, they learn that when they pick the bell, they get 5 points, and when they pick the bottle, they don't get any kind of reward. And we wait until children actually learn which item is rewarded, and then we switch it halfway through. Then all of a sudden, the bottle is the one that gets the 5-point reward, and the bell is not. Or we'll give them two totally new objects, like a bolt or a button, and they have to figure this out all over again. What we found was that children who had had very high levels of early childhood stress had lower orbital frontal cortex activity, and this was associated with slower learning. It took the children more time to figure out which item was going to be punished and which item was going to be rewarded. In a study that we have that was just published last month, we also found that when we reversed the learning, once the abused children had actually picked up and figured out what was rewarded and what was not, if we switched those relationships, the children couldn't do it. And they would continue to select the item that used to be rewarded, even after multiple trials of a different item being rewarded and this being punished. And this seems to be associated with children making a generalization about how to respond and then not updating that response when the environmental contingencies change. We think this is one of the things that is going on for these children. They've learned a way of responding to things like anger or threat that work very well in the home environment and help them cope with their abusive parents, but they've overgeneralized it. And when they're at school and they're interacting with teachers or other adults that are not harming them, when they're on the playground interacting with other children, they are continuing to respond as if anger or frustration is an indication that they might be hurt. They're generalizing across contexts, which may be one of the reasons that's leading to the kinds of behavioral problems that we see. In fact, children that had better associative learning on our laboratory task also had better behavioral control. And when we observed them playing with their friends, children who did well on the laboratory learning task ended up having better social functioning with peers. When we looked at diffusion tensor imaging, this is the communication of different neural regions that children were using to solve a problem like this. We found that the children who had experienced very high levels of early stress exposure had many fewer connections between brain regions. They were not communicating neural information between one region and another as effectively as were typically developing children. And in fact, this kind of finding is exactly consistent with the kinds of results that rodent researchers have found in looking at the effects of early stress on neural architecture in rodents. We've also looked at things like the hormonal control of emotion, because this is one of the symptoms that really has been written about a lot in the area of child abuse and early stress, looking at the HPA axis and the release of cortisol as one hormone often associated with stress and stress responsivity, as well as oxytocin, the hormone often called the love hormone, associated with comfort and bonding and social attachment. In this study, we brought, we needed to stress children out in the laboratory. The question is, how do you stress people out? We do it the German way. We used the Trier social stress test, where children come into the laboratory and they're asked to give a speech in front of an audience, and you can trust me that that does elicit a stress response. The children would sit in front of an audience of people wearing white lab coats in front of a microphone, and they would first give a speech, and then they were asked to solve math problems. This is a reliable trigger of a stress response in children. And what we did is we measured first their cortisol response. And here are just typically developing girls. These are the control girls from the community. And you can see all of these girls have read the scientific literature and know exactly how the HPA axis is supposed to work. They initially come into the lab and their cortisol is a little bit high. They're in a new environment. They've never been to a laboratory before, and cortisol is high. But we make them comfortable, they spend some time in the laboratory, cortisol comes down, and then we do this stress induction procedure, and then you can see the cortisol goes back up. Then after they give the speech and solve the math problems, they stay in the laboratory for another hour or so, and their cortisol comes back down to normal levels. And this is totally normal. This is what we would expect to see. However, when we look at this response in girls that have been severely physically abused, we see something very unusual, which is their stress system is not responding. Their cortisol system, the HPA axis, is staying relatively flat. They're not responding to the stressor, and that is very unusual. However, when we look at oxytocin, another unusual pattern is emerging. In blue along the bottom, you see that typically developing girls are not showing any increase in the hormone oxytocin during a stressor. They shouldn't. Oxytocin is something that's relieved when we're getting a hug, when we're comforted, when we feel secure. There's no reason to feel comforted or secure when you're giving a speech in front of strangers and their oxytocin system is responding correctly. And yet, the abused girls are showing a huge increase in this oxytocin response. They are opening themselves up. They're responding as you would to a comforting situation to these judges that are evaluating them. And this is very unusual. The two hormone systems have actually flipped in these children. And in fact, when we repeated this experiment and we looked at boys and girls who had had early stress exposure and who had not, everyone behaved as expected except the abused girls. And a colleague of mine who's an anthropologist and is now looking at these data believes that this might explain why girls, teenage girls who have experienced very early stress may be at risk for early pregnancy and early sexual activity. Their stress system has flipped so that when they should be more protective of themselves and backing away, they are actually opening themselves up. Perhaps to older boys or individuals that should be a source of threat to them, and they're responding to that threat by trying to seek physical comfort. The last thing I'd like to tell you about before I close is some of the new work we're doing looking at the epigenetic system. Because I told you at the beginning that it's very important to be looking at all aspects of behavior, the brain, the physiology, the overt behavior, and also the genetics. And when I was in graduate school, we used to talk about genes versus environment. We used to say, is psychopathology biological or the result of social experiences? And we had a very inadequate answer when I was training. We would say it's both. It's an interaction. Nature interacts with nurture. Now, the field of epigenetics is changing all of that, and it's suggesting that posing questions about biology versus experience is completely the wrong way for behavioral scientists to be asking these questions, because genes are turned on and off by the kinds of experiences that we have. You can have a gene, and if it's turned off, it's not going to do anything good or bad. It's just going to be sitting there turned off. And the various things that can turn a gene on include developmental experiences as a child, environmental toxins, diet, all different kinds of things that can happen in our environments. We've been looking at one particular aspect of epigenetics, which is taken from work done by Michael Meany and Moshe Ziff at McGill University in Canada, where they have found in rodents that the quality of parental care actually turns on or off the gene that's responsible for cortisol regulation in the hypothalamic adrenal pituitary axis. What they found was that better parental care decreases methylation of the glucocorticoid receptor gene, and that increases glucocorticoid receptor expression. What this means is that when rats receive good parental care and they're stressed, they show a stress response, but then they can regulate it and bring it back down. When rats are raised by mothers that don't care for them, that don't provide protection and grooming, these rats still show a stress response when they're nervous, but they can't regulate it and turn it off. We wanted to see if we could find a similar kind of effect in human children, rather than measuring the hormone directly from the brain, which we can't measure genetics in the brain. We looked peripherally in the blood, and we followed the same protocols that the rodent researchers did. And what we found was truly amazing. We found the exact same effect in the exact same gene on the same location in the gene that the rodent researchers found in the children. And this seems to make a lot of sense, because one of the problems with children that have had early stress exposure are what we call in the United States temper tantrums, problems regulating behavior, an ability to get upset, but not an ability to kind of bring down and control and regulate behavior. And this is an indication that early stress exposure may be affecting the biological systems involved in emotional regulation. Now, it is important to remember that while it's amazing that we can find the same focus of an effect across two different species, humans and rodents are not the same. Maternal care in the rodent is defined in the rodent studies as anogenital licking and grooming. I never did that with my children. And so we do need to remember that there are important differences between species, and to use the kind of findings that these studies can generate as thought-provoking experiments, but to be mindful of some of the differences. Now, one of the important things about the study that I did is we measured epigenetics in blood, not in brain. And we don't know if these epigenetic changes measured in the periphery mean the exact same thing as an epigenetic change in the hippocampus in the brain. But one of the things that we do know is that an epigenetic change in the periphery still has a behavioral effect. And one of the things that we know it will do is make less cortisol available for use by the organism, which would have an effect on the immune system. And so when we looked at immune competence, how children that have received very early and extreme stress exposure were able to fight off various kinds of pathogens, and we used herpes simplex because that is a disease that we're all carrying. Anyone who's ever been in a public place has probably picked up herpes, but most of us are able to control and regulate it. What we found was that children who had not had early stress exposure were carrying the herpes simplex virus, but were not allowing the virus to express itself. But children who'd been abused and neglected were showing expression of this virus at a much higher rate, suggesting that this window into the brain was indicating that these children's brains are still acting as if they're under stress. Their immune system is responding as all of our immune systems would respond in a stressful situation. But these children, interestingly in this study, were removed from their homes and are not currently living in a stressful situation, yet their immune system is still responding as if they were. And as you might guess, these children miss a lot of school. They get ear infections, they get colds, they get influenza, and they're often sick. And so that's another interesting window into the effects of stress, and perhaps helps us explain that first slide I showed you with the link between early stress exposure and adult heart disease. The last thing I'll do before I end is give you a sneak peek of something that hasn't been published yet, but something I'm very excited about. I'm now old enough that some of the children that I started studying when they were very young are now becoming adults. And in this study, we found children that we had originally studied in the laboratory when they were 8 years old. But these children are now entering early adulthood. They're now around 20 years old. We found them and we invited them to come back into the laboratory to revisit us. Typically, in studies of early stress exposure, adults are brought into a laboratory and they're asked by researchers about their childhood experience. And the technique is called retrospective recall. But many psychopathologists worry about this because they feel like people that have had early stressful experiences might be currently, as adults, experiencing problems like depression and stress, and that might influence how they remember and talk about their childhoods. In this case, we actually saw the children when they were children, these individuals when they were children. We met their parents. We actually were able to assess their life experiences objectively, and so we didn't have to ask them about what their childhoods were like. We knew. We recruited 52 people to come back. Half of them had what one might call normal childhoods, or kind of normal range of stress, nothing out of the ordinary happening. And half of them had had very, very extreme early life stress. We had them do an imaging task that's called a monetary incentive delay task. This is a task that is measuring judgment and decision making, where subjects had to wager a certain amount of money on each trial, but they were told beforehand whether they stood a good chance of winning or a good chance of losing. What we found was that the individuals that had had very high levels of early life stress were not anticipating potential losses. When they were presented with a signal that told them that in the next trial they were very likely to lose, they did not pay attention to it. They continued to bet a lot of money, and they lost a lot of money. At the same time, when they actually lost, they had a stronger emotional reaction than others. So they both were unable to use a cue from the environment that something in the environment might pose a risk, and then had a strong emotional reaction to having had that loss. When we asked these people to tell us about their actual behavior, and we asked them to just tell us about risky things they might do, driving without a seatbelt, driving a motorino without wearing a helmet, going to a bar in a dangerous neighborhood, not seeking treatment when they were ill, the individuals that were unable to use the cue in the experiment that a risk was about to happen were in fact the individuals engaging in more risky behaviors in their everyday life. So again, another clue about a mechanism that could be affected by children's early stressful experiences. Let me wrap up with some messages to leave you with from this talk. First, I'd like you to remember, and hope you will remember, that abusive parents feel more angry, but express their anger poorly. So abused children have a very difficult learning task ahead of them. Yet, these children do appear to learn about these critical social signals well in some respects. The problem is they don't appear good at unlearning them. They don't appear good at understanding various social contexts and learning that you should behave one way at home or one way with someone that's harming you, but you can behave a different way with people that are not harming you and maybe trying to help you. The bigger take-home message is that many aspects of brain development appear to be tied to early social experience, and this may be tied to new ways of thinking about potential prevention and intervention efforts for individuals that have been exposed to early life stress. Therefore, I'd like to make the following recommendations. One is, as a field, we need to focus on the development of the neural circuits the brain has evolved to function adaptively. We need to do a better job at categorizing the range of intact and disordered behavior that can be tied to emotional functioning. And most certainly, as clinicians and researchers, we need to use a classification scheme that's based on mechanisms or processes that organize the brain and behavior rather than traditional diagnostic categories that are simply based on symptoms. What we're going to need to do is move across levels of analysis so that instead of asking about either genes or environment, we understand how the environment is affecting genes, how genes are interacting with our environments, so that we can get a truly intact picture, an accurate picture of the kinds of experiences that lead to behavior in humans.